Okay, so this is the August director's cut for June production statistics. Please, everyone, keep it on to the topic of the director's cut and try to keep it in line. And if you have a question, send it through the chat feature. We'll try to alternate between the conference room and the webinar. Those are pretty much my rules. Use the chat bar. Other than that, I don't have anything else, so go ahead, Lynn.
Thanks, Allison, and thank you for attending or tuning in to the Director's Cut. This month's theme is When Elephants Fight. There's an old African proverb that says, when elephants fight, the grass suffers. And so I'm going to talk about elephant fights that are going on around the world and particularly affecting North Dakota. We'll start, though, with a little bit on production. Production down just slightly, 1%, still above 1 million barrels a day. Based on the field data coming in, it looks like we're going to stay above that 1 million barrels a day, at least into the winter weather. It becomes impossible to guess once we get into winter weather as to how that might affect it. But June was at 1,032,000. July looks solid at over 1 million, and August is shaping up to be very similar. So we should be staying in that 1 million to 1,050,000 range for the foreseeable future. Gas production down a little bit more, 2%, and I think Justin will talk about this, but we had some major mechanical repairs being done on some of our big transmission lines. So we had some wells shut in, we had some gas go to flare, and you saw that flaring was up as well, but gas production down just slightly. New all-time high in terms of the number of producing wells, very strong numbers in terms of permitting. We jumped from 109 permits in June to 146 in July, so almost 40% increase. We still haven't seen the gap close between North Dakota Sweet and West Texas Intermediate crude oil, but as Justin has talked about, we think that'll take some weeks, months, maybe longer in order for that gap to completely close. Completions were down just slightly, and I think that maybe explains why we saw a little bit of a drop in oil production. The first place where we see the elephants fighting is between OPEC and the Permian Basin. OPEC extended their production cuts, but their compliance with the production allocations of the OPEC members has been pretty poor. And particularly in July, almost all of them overproduced or cheated on their quotas. So at the same time, we've seen the Permian Basin with continued active drilling and increased production. So we're seeing, again, the prices being affected by increased OPEC production and increased Permian Basin production. And so we've got a couple of elephants there that are fighting it out. And North Dakota gets caught in the middle and affected by the oil prices that results in, which are still less than $50 for West Texas Intermediate. We saw the number of wells, as we expected, waiting on completion go up because we still have more drilling rigs than frac crews, and so they're able to drill wells faster than they can frac them. And so we saw the waiting on completion inventory climb by 35, even though we're into summer months. So that's going to be an ongoing problem going into the fall if we continue in the upper 50s on rig count and are not able to get to 25 or more frac crews, and we're still not there. Inactive well count went down some, not nearly as much as we expected, but I think as the summer months continue on, we'll see that number drop even further. I want to talk a little bit about flaring. You see a real problem developing on Fort Berthold in the Bakken and in particular in the Trust. Outside of Fort Berthold, gas capture is at 91%, well above state goals at this point in time. But on Fort Berthold, trust lands are at 79% and fee lands at 81%. I think inordinately affected by the problems with the gas transmission lines, and the maintenance on those. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. I just this week got a filing by a company called Arrow, and they are planning a new gas processing plant south of Watford City to process 200 million a day, with the expectation that by mid-year 2018, it'll be up and running. So they're moving to relieve this gas capture problem that we have on Fort Berthold, but it is an ongoing problem, and we're going to have to watch it very closely because it's pulling the statewide average down quite a bit. And so part of the problem is lack of processing capacity, but an even bigger part of the problem is the difficulty of getting BIA right away. The step is, there's too many steps in the process, and they take way too long. The last thing I want to talk about is on the federal front on rulemaking, and there's just a huge amount of stuff going on there. First of all, in the BLM venting and flaring rule, a new development with California and New Mexico and some environmental organizations filing a lawsuit in Northern California, which will compete with the Wyoming litigation on the BLM venting and flaring rule, and also with all of the motions and deadlines that are going on in the 10th Circuit for appeals on that. So now we're going to add another court on the California coast that potentially is going to get involved in this litigation. North Dakota is going to attempt to work with the BLM to get that all consolidated and brought back to Judge Skavdal in Wyoming, who's been looking at it from the beginning. We'll see how successful that is. A little bit of action on the BLM hydraulic fracturing rule. There's oral arguments took place on that rule, and as you can see in our director's cut, we posted a place where you can go listen to those if you're excited about listening to our attorneys argue about hydraulic fracturing. There's a recording of the day's oral arguments. BLM has moved the ball on sage grouse. Secretary Zinke asked for a review. He got the final report. Let me see, the final report was just released a few days ago on proposed changes to the federal sage grouse management plan. And so I just got that copy this week. We'll be reviewing it and talking with North Dakota Game and Fish to see if there's anything that North Dakota should be doing with regards to that sage grouse plan. I'm going to skip over the one BLM item and cover that last. On the EPA front, on the methane rule, there is a new proposed stay, a 2-year stay on the BLM methane, or the EPA methane rule. The DC Circuit Court denied API's motion for a review on the 90-day stay. EPA has now put out a 2-year stay proposal, and North Dakota has commented in support of that stay. And then on waters of the U.S., EPA has a rulemaking out there. Comments are due August 28th, and the state agencies are working together to submit comments on the waters of the U.S. The last one I wanted to cover, Bureau of Land Management, the MHA Nation appealed Slosson's torpedo pad drilling to what's called the Interior Board of Land Appeals. And yesterday, the IBLA issued a stay of the drilling. And there will be further review on whether any future drilling can happen. The reason that's a big issue is there's a drilling rig on one of the wells right now. So we've been in discussions with the Bureau of Land Management. They're going to allow Slosson to drill that well down to the casing point and set and cement 7-inch casing. If they didn't, it would be an enormous environmental risk sitting out there uncased. And so they're going to allow them to drill into or through the weekend to set and cement casing in that well so it can be secured and protect groundwater. And then at that point, they have to stop operations. So there's 8 wells on the pad. They've all been drilled to the surface casing point. One of them will have been drilled down to the formation level. It involves private, state, and federal minerals, and it's on private land, but it's within Fort Berthold boundaries. So this thing brings together all of the jurisdictional issues that we ever talk about. State jurisdiction, local jurisdiction, tribal jurisdiction, Bureau of Land Management jurisdiction, all of those things come together at this site. So this will be a very fascinating test case. And you probably read about it or saw information about it this week. It's the one with the sound wall by Van Hook. And so it's easy to spot. It's got a 30 to 40 foot tall sound wall around the south and east side of the pad. And so we don't know a lot about what North Dakota might or might not do in terms of that appeal. Clearly, the big issue is Slauson and the BLM versus the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation. And so I don't know if North Dakota will have a role to play in there, but obviously we'll be discussing it because it affects our jurisdiction in terms of permitting wells, and it affects the Trust Lands Department because there are state leases. And I just had a conversation with the director over there, or the commissioner, and he said that Slauson has filed for an extension of the state leases. Apparently they will expire during the time that this thing is under a stay and on appeal. So it is a big old mess. And that's my direct report. We'll take some questions, Allison.
None from the webinar yet, but I think
Okay.
they'll probably start coming in and everybody absorbs that. So
Can you talk a bit more about, you're talking about clearing of Fort Berthold Reservation, and the numbers that we're seeing, are they like an increase from previous months, or just an issue going on around? And then can you talk a bit more about, you mentioned the right-of-way issue with the BIA?
Sure. So the question from the room here was more discussion about gas capture on Fort Berthold, and is this a trend? Is it something we've been seeing happening, and what are the issues behind it? So up until about 3 months ago, gas capture on the reservation on Fort Berthold was pretty much matching up with statewide gas capture. But beginning in March or April, we started to see them fall seriously behind. Part of that was drilling and completion activity with some force majeure and that sort of thing, but it has turned into a trend. And so let's talk a little bit. So the gas capture on Fort Berthold has gotten worse every month for 3 months. So it's on a serious downward trend. And that's alarming in that we're now statewide at the average that November 1st of next year kicks in as the maximum amount of flaring or the minimum amount of gas capture that we're going to allow statewide. So it began with the acquisition of the Robinson Lake plant by then Tesoro, now Endeavor, from Whiting. When they acquired that, they went through pretty much a complete test of the plant to see if the equipment was operating at safe pressures and according to at safe rates and pressures and all of that. They discovered that it was okay, but so it was a temporary shutdown, but it caused a significant amount of flaring. Following that, we met with the gas gathering and gas capture companies and discovered that there are 2 significant gathering pipeline projects for Mandaree and Newtown districts that have been held up by the BIA right-of-way process. One of them finally, after almost 3 years, got approved. And it'll get constructed this year, but it's not in place yet. The other one still hasn't gotten approved, and it's 3 years and running. So that's going to be our bigger long-term problem. And then as I talked about, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Companies like Arrow Gathering have plans to expand and also expand their processing, but that's not going to happen until next year. So it's a multitude of problems, but probably the biggest, most difficult one is the BIA right-of-way process. And we've been in some conversations with Secretary Zinke about the possibility of BIA and Department of Interior delegating that authority to the tribe. The tribal process seems to be working pretty well, but there's at least 3 times during their process that the paperwork has to jump over to the BIA, and it gets held up every time.
Do you know when the one pipeline that was approved, do you know when the BIA approved that?
They approved it in May of this year, and the other one is still pending.
Can you offer any more details on the proposed gas plant south of Watford City?
I can. Let's see if there is a proposal, let me see, Arrow Field Services is going to put in a processing plant. They have filed with the North Dakota Public Service Commissioner, with the North Dakota Public Service Commission, a corridor and a route permit for gas pipeline and a natural gas liquids pipeline. And it's going to be 7.5 miles southeast of Watford City. Scheduled to begin construction in the spring of 18. So it won't be on until year-end 18 at best. Maybe I think Justin's giving me hand signals, maybe even 2020.
Oh, no, 30 million is the capacity of the plant.
Okay. They say in their application that the natural gas plant processing capacity will be up to 200 million a day. And so maybe they got some intermediate steps in there. But we could certainly provide people with the documents that I got as far as filing with the Public Service Commission. We have a map where it's going to be located and a whole paragraph about the information on when construction is going to begin and all of that. So, yeah.
And that would presumably take some of the gas from Fort Berthold.
Yeah, they gather from the western third of Fort Berthold. So this would really relieve stress in the Mandaree district.
Is the DOC the only permit they need there, or are they going to have other permitting that need to be done?
I think the Public Service Commission is the only permits they'll need. I believe that the pipeline right-of-way that they're still waiting on will be required. So they still have to get that right-of-way from the BIA. So the gathering pipeline will require BIA approval, but the processing plant, just the Public Service Commission.
Do you have any other details as far as what kind of repairs they were doing on transmission lines that affected, this is gas production, but I'm assuming they mean gas capture? Yeah, it was my understanding that they were doing a turnaround on some compressor stations, as well as a tie-in for some additional processed gas coming out of the Wild Basin from Oasis. So they actually had part of the plant or the pipeline for a few days shut down and isolated so that they could tie in a residue line.
One other question for you. You said we're not yet at 25 frac crews like we would like in North Dakota. Do you know what we're at today?
The information I got this morning was that we're at 22. So
that hasn't really changed.
Hasn't really changed from last month, no. And it's a real struggle. They're trying to hire, but they're just not getting the experienced, qualified people that they want. So they're either going to have to hire inexperienced people and train them, which will take time, or do without. So.
Could you repeat what that question was?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the question was about frac crews. Did I know how many frac crews were working today?
Okay. And then could you go back to what you said at the beginning about gas production, maybe clarify a little bit? This was again about the repairs on the transmission line. Can you explain what you mean by gas production fell because of higher flaring and repairs on transmission lines?
Yeah, so because of the force majeure and the repairs on the transmission line, they shut in some wells and restricted some wells. I mean, they're still limited in the amount that we allow them to flare. Force majeure can allow some flaring, but regardless of that, when the transmission line is down, they choke wells back and reduce production. So.
I'm not familiar with that term, force majeure.
Oh.
Can you explain that?
Okay, yeah, it's French words, and what it means is really essentially an act of God. It's something that happens that is unavoidable, and legally it allows people to get out of their contract temporarily. So it's I guess literally it would translate major force, something unintended that happens that allows people to go outside their contract.
And which pipeline was that?
I believe it's Northern Border.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Is there going to be any push to try to train new crews? I think we're talking about fracking here, so we can get more crews to look ahead the long term.
Yes, that's what I'm being told, is that both of our major fracking companies, Schlumberger, Baker Hughes, and all three, Halliburton, are training people, but some of the operators are not happy with the performance of the inexperienced crews, and so it's been a struggle to get them on the job experience because some of the crews have too many inexperienced hands on them, or they work too slow, and the operators get unhappy. And so they've been very careful not to lose a customer in the process of trying to train inexperienced people. Okay. One last question we see here. We'll take this because we got time. How do you think it just takes experience for these crews to get confidence in the newer frac crews? What do you think it's going to take? Yeah, I think the deal is if they could have enough experienced people and mix the inexperienced ones in with them, that they'll learn how to do the work faster and the customers will be happy. The problem that the operators are having is when they show up with a crew and there's a large percentage of green hard hats, and then they're worried about the safety and also the speed that the crew can work at. So if they could, now obviously if you do that, you lose some efficiency from the folks who are used to working together. And so when you start mixing the new men and women in with the experienced people, then you start changing the dynamics of that whole frac crew, and all of the crews get slower. But that's really what has to happen. Okay. All right. We will switch to JK. Well, do you want to or not? Ready when you are, Mr. Kringstad.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Justin Kringstad, Director of the North Dakota Pipeline Authority. I will first just get into the regular material. There's some definite updates that I think a lot of folks will be interested in with the June numbers. And so just to reiterate what's happening around the region, again, Eastern Montana, South Dakota lagging a little bit behind North Dakota in the reporting. However, there's currently only one operating rig in Eastern Montana, and South Dakota still has 0 operating rigs. So I don't expect any type of significant shifts in the production trends in those areas for the whole, again, the takeaway capacity issues and production movements for the region. And so this is really where things start to get interesting for the month of June. And so now we're looking at the first month that Dakota Access was in full commercial service. And so we saw a significant shift for a couple of reasons in the way that oil was being moved around the region. And so the first thing, you'll notice obviously that the large increase in the pipeline market share. You'll also notice an increase in the refined market share. That was primarily due to the month of May, with the Tesoro Mandan refinery being down for a turnaround, and that was back online in June. So if you compare May to June numbers, you'll see a couple shifts, both on the pipeline side because of Dakota Access, and on the refinery side because of the Mandan Tesoro facility being back in service. And so what this looks like from a trend perspective, again, that major shift, the blue line is that market share of pipelines, and the purple is the rail market share. And so rail now, again, as you saw on the previous slide, is from a market share perspective is on par then with local refining, and even in the current market, the trucking that's taking place from North Dakota into Canada. As far as the price spreads, I'll touch on that here in a moment. Again, nothing in the near term that's indicated any type of major market shift that would make these lines start to shift because of pricing dynamics. And so what does that do from a volume standpoint or volume estimates? And so for the month of June, it's right around 1 to 1.5 trains estimated to still be leaving the region filled with crude oil, primarily heading to the west coast, as you'll see in slide 6. And so this is an update for the month of May. Again, that's the most recent available. But again, you can see 70+% of the oil leaving North Dakota heading towards the west coast in the month of May. We expect that trend to continue as we move into June, July. My expectation, again, not having the hard numbers, but is that we'll see, again, increased market share of the remaining barrels going towards the west coast as opposed to the east coast or the Gulf. Pricing dynamics around the U.S., this again is what the refiners are paying in the various PAD regions. You can see that, again, PAD 1 having the highest, but again, in the current market conditions, I don't anticipate that's going to be a high enough spread to make it attractive for folks to start looking at additional rail to the east coast. We'll continue to see the pipeline utilization of the Gulf, and then any remaining rail movements to that west coast PAD 5 area. As of this morning, the price spread, again, Brent to WTI, that's always just a good indicator, a little over $3 a barrel. That's a little bit stronger, a little bit higher than it has been in the last couple months, so we'll continue to watch that. As well, the LLS pricing relative to WTI is up a little bit higher than it has been recently as well. And so, again, LLS is a barrel that is relatively comparable with something of the Bakken quality. So as those Bakken barrels start to get down to the Gulf Coast, we can reasonably assume that they're going to be somewhere in that neighborhood or a competitive type marketplace with an LLS barrel. As far as the truck movements, again, some movement or some interesting things happening. We're still continuing to see the truck movements from North Dakota north into Canada stay at a relatively high level. However, we did see a decrease in the number of barrels coming in to North Dakota. And so it was just kind of a side note. I had some good conversations. We were in West Hope a few weeks ago. Had a chance to talk with some landowners and some folks that are experienced in this up in that neck of the woods, and they did confirm that, yes, they're seeing a significantly higher level of traffic here in the last 6 months or so. And even one of them giving me more details that they were seeing less trucks coming in with crude, and that was reflected in the data that was pulled here as well. So just some good conversations. It was good to get some ground truthing to some of the data that we're getting from the federal government, and be able to talk to some folks that really were in the know. So that was helpful for me to confirm some of these movements. So what does this mean? So one of the big questions I know that'll come up, so now that Dakota Access is in service, what does this mean long term for the region? What you're looking at on slide 10, this is one of the tools I use to look at future oil production and what type of transportation options are on the table for moving that crude oil. And so the green portion of this chart, that's pipeline capacity. And you'll notice the large increase in June of this year, was Dakota Access coming online. Everything to the left of June of this year, you'll notice that black line is in the gray area. And so we had production higher than the pipeline capacity out of the region. And so we were reliant on a combination of pipeline, and then rail is that gray colored chunk on this chart. So again, for the first time, starting in June, we're now in an environment where we have adequate pipeline capacity. There is technically enough pipeline capacity to move all the production. So then the question becomes, how long does that last for the region? And what you're looking at in red and then continued in the dark gray are my forecast curves for future North Dakota or future Williston Basin oil production. And you'll notice that the red line and the gray line, somewhere in the early 2020s to mid 2020s, we get ourselves back in a position where we're looking at production exceeding pipeline capacity. And so those are really the things that the industry is focused on right now. It takes typically 3 to 5+ years to put together any sizable type of pipeline project, so that operators, either the current ones or others that are looking at the region for opportunities or looking at charts such as this, doing their own modeling, trying to figure out whether or not additional pipeline capacity is necessary, what the timeline of any type of additional capacity may be necessary. And again, starting to formulate some plans, concepts, and ideas of what that may look like. And so going forward, at least for the near term, the next several years, we expect him in a position where we have adequate pipeline capacity, but longer term, the expectation is that production will again exceed the pipeline capacity, and we're going to be looking at a situation of additional transportation needs out of the region, whether that's met by a new pipeline project, an expanded pipeline, or the use of rail. The market will decide that going forward, but that is definitely something to keep in the back of everyone's mind as we start moving forward here. One note, I think I've mentioned this a few months back when this became public, but you'll notice a little purple box. There was, for a period of time, another chunk of pipeline capacity, 220,000 barrels for the Trans-Canada Upland project. Earlier this year, I believe it was in April or May, Trans-Canada asked the State Department to pause that review for that project, and so that's been pulled off of this chart and off of the table for the time being until some more details are available about that project. So now moving into the natural gas world, as Lynn alluded to, we did see an increase in flaring in the month of June. It was taking place from wells that were connected to a pipeline system. As Lynn mentioned briefly, there was a significant amount of maintenance, whether that was on pipeline systems themselves or gas plants that were doing some type of maintenance work. It seemed like throughout much of June, there was always a time period where one project or another had some type of maintenance ongoing. So it's a very active month. As we move into July, a lot of those projects were completed, and July was looking a little bit more normal as far as getting gas gathered, processed, and put onto the pipeline network. And so I would expect when we start to see the July numbers, we may see a slight decrease back to maybe the April, May type flaring numbers. Again, thinking that June was maybe a little bit of an anomaly because of maintenance. And as you see here, again, that historical trend, May, June, just a slight increase as we were coming into the summer months and the maintenance months. But coming into July, August, I expect we may start to move back into a more normal type operations. As far as gas gathering goes, getting new wells connected, basically right on pace. The number of new wells connected to processing, as well as new wells being completed, so that's a good sign. And both of those lines are trending together for the time being. And on the natural gas liquids, just a very quick update on this. We're looking at in the month of May, this was the highest volume of natural gas liquids processed and collected in North Dakota. And as we see higher gas production volumes, higher gas capture rates, we're going to continue to see these natural gas liquid volumes increase, and the transportation needs for these liquids increase as well. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Wow, that's a lot of stuff.
Justin, can you go back to slide 10?
Yes.
So you have these two different projections. It looks like case 1 and case 2, that red line and that dark gray line. Can you talk about those different projections?
Yep, and so the question was about case 1 and case 2. And so I didn't include it in this presentation just for sake of time. I believe on my website, or I can get anyone the background assumptions built into here, but it has to do with activity levels. And so in the near term, case 1 follows, I believe it's 90 new wells for the next 4 years. 90 new wells per month for the next 4 years. Case 2 follows, I believe it's 65 new wells for the next 6 years before they both start trending upwards with increased activity levels. So it just depends upon, again, price drives activity, and then the activity built in case 1 and case 2 is what drives the forecast model. So.
Okay, and then if you could go back to, I don't know what slide it was, but your pie chart here that shows the transportation percentages. Yep. Okay, so we're at 78% now with the first month of Dakota access. Can you talk about what you expect going forward, if those numbers are going to be similar, if you still expect them to change?
Yep, and so the question was, where do we see these percentages? I'm going to actually slip, for those on the webinar, to slide 4, kind of the historical trends, where do we see this going? A few things drive this. Obviously, as we saw in the month of June, as a new pipeline system comes online, we see the utilization by pipeline increase. And what does this mean in July? I expect that we'll see similar type of numbers, at least in the near term. Long term, it's going to depend upon several things. Market conditions. Do we see any type of shift in market pricing? Again, in the next 3 months or so, I don't anticipate anything of that nature. Over the long term, that's really up in the air. And then production volumes. But in the current situation where we have adequate pipeline capacity, we've got some buffer built in. I would expect that any incremental growth in production will likely be moving on the pipeline network. So as production increases over the next 3, 6 months to a year plus, I would anticipate that most of that is going to be absorbed into the pipeline system itself. Percentage-wise, I don't have any of those numbers calculated, so I can't give it to you. But just in general, any new production will likely be moving on the pipeline systems, increasing that market share.
And then you were talking kind of before we started today about Dakota access. I was asking about, is that full capacity yet? And do we know the answer to that? Can you talk about during the month of June, like how they might have ramped that up, how long that process might take to get to full capacity?
Yep. And so the question for those in the webinar was about new pipeline systems, how they typically operate. So when a new pipeline system typically goes into service, they do not operate at full capacity initially. Typically, the contracts are structured in that companies have a period of time to phase in their commitment levels. And so I don't anticipate us being at full capacity with Dakota Access for quite some time, whether that's 3 months, 6 months. I don't have any of those details. But in the near term, for the month of June, no, they were not operating at full capacity.
And then as we get closer to that full capacity, do you expect those percentages to change?
Correct. And so as barrels that were committed at certain time frames start being delivered to that system, whether they're pulled off of the rail network or whether they're pulled away from an incumbent pipeline system, that we don't have those details. So it's tough to say whether or not there will be an overall shift in pipeline percentages or whether it's just going to be barrels pulled from one pipeline system to another pipeline system.
I was going to ask if you knew if it was affecting other pipeline capacities, or not capacity, but what was going through them as well, the quantities.
Yeah, and so in a situation like this where we've got excess pipeline capacity, it gets very competitive between all transportation modes, whether it's a pipe versus rail or pipe versus pipe. And then you're looking at, again, where each pipeline system, what their destinations are, what their rate structures are, whether you have barrels committed on one or the other system. And so it gets very, very competitive, and you'll see barrels pulled from one system to another, maybe long term if they've got commitments shifting from one system to another, maybe even month to month. If someone just is playing the spot market where they want to move barrels 1 month to one destination, 1 month to a different destination, they may be shuffling back and forth.
Well, we don't know if that's going on yet, or do we?
Well, so we know that just given the current environment with excess pipeline capacity, that yes, the pipeline companies are definitely competing, again, not only against rail, but then also against each other for market share. Just like any other business model, they are going to be very competitive with each other to try and either keep customers or draw new barrels to their system.
And can you track that? Do they report to you the quantities that are going through each pipeline? Can you tell how, I guess, the end destinations, like where the oil is shifting from one part of the country to the other in that way?
I don't have any details on the end destination, whether they're, how many barrels are ultimately ended up saying the Gulf Coast refining industry, how many are ended up in Cushing or the Great Lakes. However, my estimates for the summer months is that likely the incumbent pipeline systems, the existing ones, will probably see maybe a 10 to 20% decrease in their overall volumes based upon barrels shifting onto the new pipeline system.
Could you give numbers like how many we have going to the Gulf, how many we have going east?
I don't have, so question was, do we have any details as far as how many Bakken barrels ultimately end up in the Gulf versus the east or the west coast?
Pipeline systems, actually.
Yep, and so I don't have any of those end destination. Once they leave North Dakota, there really isn't a good mechanism that I'm aware of tracking whether or not that barrel ultimately ends up in, say, Cushing or the Great Lakes or the Gulf.
And then you had thrown out a number earlier, about like 1 to 1.5 trains per day. Can you talk to me again about what that number was in reference to, and is that a change from like previous months?
Yeah, and so the question was on the estimated volumes leaving, and so it doesn't, on slide 5 is what I'm going to reference here in the room, doesn't show up real well for the month of June just because of the way the chart shifted, but usually I give a high and a low estimate for rail because again I don't have the hard numbers. So my estimate was somewhere between 65 and 95,000 barrels leaving the region by rail. That would be equivalent to about 1 to 1.5 trains on average per day.
And that is for which month?
June.
Okay, and then is that a change from previous months?
That's correct. And so even, depending on which month you reference, at its peak, we were over 800,000 barrels per day of crude leaving the region by rail car. It's gone down with the decreased overall production and as other pipeline systems gain market share because of pricing conditions and things like that. But last year, crude by rail has been going down, trending downwards, and then with Dakota Access coming online, even a more significant drop for the month of June.
It looks like the last couple of months you've been around like 300,000 barrels a day, maybe a little bit under.
Correct. Yeah.
Or it's not by day.
That's barrels per day. Yes.
The crude that is leaving by rail now, is that mostly Tesoros?
That, as far as, so the question was, the remaining crude by rail that is leaving, who's the shipper or the owner of that? Those are details that I don't have. Those are kept confidential by the rail companies and the shippers themselves. Knowing the destination is about as close as we can get to understanding the dynamics. And again, with most of those barrels being anticipated to continue moving to the west coast, the PAD 5 region.
And so previously, is it fair to say that Bakken oil is no longer reaching the East Coast? Because wasn't it transported by rail to the East Coast, correct?
Correct. And so the question was on the East Coast deliveries of Bakken crude. And so the only way for North Dakota crude to reach the East Coast is by rail movement, similar or in the same fashion as the West Coast. The only way to get to the PAD 5 or PAD 1 is by rail car. And there's been statements by industry participants on the East Coast, as well as even the hard data that we're seeing come from the EIA, that those barrels moving to the East Coast are dropping off significantly and may at some point in the current market conditions go away in the near term.
And then was oil by rail going anywhere else other than the West and East Coast, or were those the two destinations?
Primarily it was going to the East and West Coast. There were some barrels that were still being delivered to the Gulf and some barrels that were being delivered regionally within PAD 2, which is likely the Cushing market. But by and large, the lion's share was either going to PAD 1 or 5, the East and West Coast.
And then do we expect Dakota Access to have any impact on the amount of oil that's refined here in North Dakota? And
the question was, will Dakota Access impact the local refining market? That I don't anticipate occurring. Again, those localized refineries are geared for local market, supplying, again, their gasoline, diesel fuels to the regional market. And so I don't tie those two together. I would anticipate the local refineries to continue operating in similar fashion, pre and post Dakota Access.
I got one more for you.
Yep.
Do we expect Dakota Access to have an impact on truck traffic, up to Canada? And then we could also talk about why we send oil by trucks up to Canada to go through those pipelines, it looks like.
Yep, and so, remind me of the first question.
We expect Dakota Access to change the truck numbers up to Canada.
Yeah, and so, the impact on Dakota Access and the trucking numbers, we will see. I was anticipating that maybe even, if someone was looking at slide 9 on my chart here, that maybe even in the month of June, we would have seen less crude being exported as the market conditions shift in North Dakota. We haven't seen it yet, and so until there's some hard numbers, I don't want to speculate because it's, again, a decision made by the marketing companies based upon current dynamics. So time will tell. I guess I don't have a good answer for you on that.
And then why do we send oil?
Oh, why? Yep.
To Canada?
Yep. And so the barrels that are being moved either north and south of the border, it may be as simple in some cases as there may be a Canadian pipeline terminal that's closer driving north than it is driving south. It may be a situation where a marketing company has commitments in one area north or south of the border that they're trying to meet certain commitment levels that they have obligations to. Maybe a situation where for marketing reasons they want to blend a sweet or a sour barrel with other crude grades in order to meet certain spec levels that the market would give them a better price advantage. So again, there's several reasons that it may be occurring. The companies that do perform this, they're very competitive with each other, so there's really not a lot of public details or information that I'm able to find to provide any more color than that, because again, they don't want their competitors knowing exactly what they're doing.
Question from the webinar. Last month you talked about no pipelines going to the West Coast. So can you explain how the market share can be high on the West Coast when train departures are low?
And so the market share is just relative to, so looking at slide 6, relative to other destinations. And so even while the overall volumes are going down, of the remaining volumes, majority of those are moving to the West Coast. And so that percentage is not necessarily a volume, but a market share relative to other destinations.
Meaning it's not going anywhere else but the West Coast primarily.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, good question. Okay, I don't see anything else. So with that, we will call it a director's cut.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cool.